Title: The Odor of Fear. Chapter 1. The Smell of Something Wrong. The town of Greyfall had always been a place where the shadows lingered just a little too long. A place where the rustling of wind through the trees sounded like whispers, and the streets, though seemingly quaint, always felt slightly too quiet. It wasn't a place where strangers were welcomed easily. It wasn't a place where questions were answered. And for a long time, it hadn't been a place anyone cared to visit. But that was before the smell. It started slowly, as things often do when they are destined to grow into something unbearable. First, there was the faintest trace of decay, as though something had been left to rot somewhere nearby. People thought little of it. Maybe a dead animal, perhaps a forgotten pile of rubbish. Some stray smell caught on the wind, but it lingered. A persistent, gnawing presence, clinging to the air, to the skin. The odor, foul and sour, crept into homes and markets, tainting the food, the water, the very breath of those who lived in Greyfall. Emily had always been drawn to stories. A journalist by trade, she spent her days seeking out the kind of truths that others dared not confront. Greyfall wasn't the first town she'd visited in her search for stories that would capture the public's attention. But something about this place felt different. There was a darkness here that she couldn't explain, a sense of oppression that weighed down on the bones of the town itself. At first, she thought little of the strange stench. It wasn't unusual for a small town to have its share of oddities, and the people of Greyfall were always quick to shrug off anything out of the ordinary. But when the odor began to grow stronger, darker, more pungent, it began to get under her skin. It wasn't just the smell itself that bothered her. It was the fact that no one seemed willing to talk about it. When Emily asked the locals, they gave her nervous glances, muttering something about old town troubles and bad luck. Most of them simply looked away, changing the subject or offering an awkward smile. It wasn't like them to ignore a question, especially not one from an outsider, and yet there was something in the air that made them avoid speaking plainly. The smell seemed to follow Emily, clinging to her like an unwanted shadow. At first it was just a brief whiff, an unpleasant odor that would appear as she passed certain streets or entered certain buildings. But soon, it was everywhere. She would wake up to it in the morning, her pillow carrying the faintest trace of it, a sour metallic scent that lingered in her nostrils, even after she'd washed her face and dressed. By the time she stepped outside, it was all around her, inescapable. It was as if the town itself had become saturated with it. The air had begun to feel thick, heavy, cloying. Emily found herself walking with a slight unease, glancing over her shoulder as she passed the darkened alleyways and old, crumbling storefronts. The town seemed to be holding its breath, as though it feared what would come next. And though Emily had no reason to believe in superstitions or folklore, she couldn't shake the sense that something more than a bad smell was at work here. One afternoon, as the sun dipped lower in the sky, painting the world in the muted golds and reds of twilight, Emily found herself standing in front of an old house near the edge of town. It was a place she had passed many times before, but today something drew her to it, as if the house itself was calling her. The building had been abandoned for as long as anyone could remember. It was a large, rambling structure, once elegant perhaps, but now covered in peeling paint and ivy, its windows dark and uninviting. The smell was stronger here, so thick that it seemed to pulse in the air like a living thing. It curled around her, tugging at her, wrapping her in an invisible shroud. Emily's breath caught in her throat, her pulse quickening. She could feel something strange in the pit of her stomach, a kind of magnetic pull that made her want to step forward, and yet, at the same time, made her want to run. Something wasn't right here. She took a hesitant step toward the house, her shoes crunching on the gravel path that led to the front door. The door itself was ajar, just slightly, as if inviting her in, or warning her away. The smell, now unmistakable, emanated from within the house. It was so pungent it made her eyes water, and yet, she couldn't stop herself from pushing the door open further. The floor creaked under her weight as she stepped inside. The air was stale, thick with dust and decay. Cobwebs draped from the corners of the room, and the once beautiful wooden floors were covered in a layer of grime. The smell was worse here, almost unbearable, filling her lungs with a thick, sour stench that made her stomach churn. It was the smell of death. Emily's eyes scanned the room, searching for something, anything that would explain it. The place was deserted, empty of furniture, empty of life. But something was wrong. A coldness clung to the walls, and the silence was absolute. She stepped deeper into the house, her flashlight cutting through the gloom, revealing long-forgotten remnants of a life left behind. A broken chair, an overturned vase, the remnants of an old photograph frame. It was as if time itself had stopped here, frozen in place by some unseen force. And then she heard it, a faint, sharp sniffing sound, like the noise a person makes when they smell something foul. But it wasn't coming from her. It was coming from deeper within the house. Emily's heart skipped a beat. The sound echoed in the stillness, reverberating off the walls, and she felt a chill race down her spine. There was something in this house, something unseen, moving in the shadows. She froze, trying to make sense of what she had just heard, but the darkness around her was too thick, too oppressive. Her breath caught in her throat as she strained to hear it again, but the sniffing stopped as abruptly as it had started. For a long moment she stood motionless, her senses straining for any sign of movement. Her flashlight trembled in her hand, casting jittery shadows on the walls. Nothing moved. The silence returned, but it was a silence full of tension, as if something was waiting, watching. Emily's mind raced, her instincts screaming at her to leave, but her feet were rooted to the spot. She couldn't move. And then, just as she was about to turn and flee, she heard it once more. The sniffing was closer now, almost as if it was right behind her. Emily's breath came in ragged gasps as she spun around, but there was nothing there. Nothing but the crushing darkness. The smell, however, had intensified, so thick it felt like a tangible force pressing against her chest, suffocating her. It wasn't just decay anymore. It was something far worse. It was something alive. Suddenly, a voice, soft and distant, echoed in her mind. "You shouldn't be here." Her heart hammered in her chest, her pulse deafening in her ears. Emily stumbled backward, reaching for the door, but it seemed farther away than it had been when she first entered. The room was stretching, expanding, growing longer as though it were shifting, bending reality itself. The sniffing grew louder, now rhythmic, as though it was pacing behind her, following her every move. And then, just as she reached the door, she felt it, cold, clammy fingers brush against her neck. She screamed. The door slammed shut behind her with an unnatural force, trapping her inside. The smell hit her again, more pungent than ever, and the sniffing intensified into a maddening sound, ringing in her ears. It was too late to leave now. The thing in the house had already found her. Chapter 2. The first encounter. The next few days in Greyfall were consumed by an unbearable quiet. The oppressive stench that had seeped into the town's air lingered, like an unwelcome guest that refused to leave. It wasn't just the smell itself that bothered people. It was the sense of something lurking just beneath the surface. The town felt like a place caught in a perpetual twilight, where the hours stretched long and uneasy, and even the sun seemed reluctant to set. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that the town was watching her, waiting for her to uncover something that she wasn't supposed to know. The faces of the locals had grown even more withdrawn, their eyes flickering nervously whenever she asked about the smell. Every conversation seemed to end abruptly, as if her words were a spark that could ignite something darker. The place had an air of secrets, old and deep, that clung to the land itself. But Emily was determined. She had lived her entire life chasing stories that others were too afraid to tell. She wasn't going to let something as intangible as a strange odor stop her. If anything, it only made her more resolute. She had to find the source of the smell, the source of the dread that had settled over the town like a shroud. There was something here, something hidden, something hungry. That afternoon, as the sun began its slow descent behind the crumbling buildings, Emily made her decision. She would return to the old house. She needed to see it again, to dig deeper into the place where the smell had first seemed to grow thick and suffocating. It was the only lead she had, and even if the feeling in her gut told her to stay away, the journalist in her pressed forward. The path to the house was as quiet as ever. The trees lining the street stood tall and unmoving, their branches like the gnarled fingers of some ancient thing reaching toward the sky. Emily walked with purpose, her boots tapping softly against the cracked pavement, but her mind was elsewhere, already envisioning what she might find inside. When she arrived, the house loomed over her like a forgotten giant. It was worse this time. The once faint odor had turned rancid, curling through the air with a sickening intensity. Emily felt a sudden knot of fear in her stomach, but she forced herself to stand tall, to ignore the unease that prickled at the edges of her consciousness. She was a journalist after all. Fear had no place here. The door was open, just as it had been before, but now it seemed almost too inviting, as though it were beckoning her in. The smell was overpowering, a mixture of rotting meat, wet earth, and something metallic, like old blood. It burned the back of her throat, the stench crawling up into her nostrils and making her head spin. She hesitated at the threshold, her breath shallow, her body tense. There was something wrong with this house, something far worse than any old dust or decay. But she couldn't turn back now, not when the answers were so close. Stepping over the threshold, Emily felt the temperature drop sharply. The chill was immediate and all-encompassing, sinking into her bones, making her skin break out in goosebumps. She flicked on her flashlight and swept the beam across the darkened interior. The house had not changed. If anything, it seemed to have become even more dilapidated, the walls more warped, the air more suffocating. But there was something else now, something far more unsettling. As she moved deeper into the house, she could feel it. The space around her seemed to close in, the walls pressing in just a little too tight. The floorboards creaked under her feet, but there was a strange rhythm to the sounds now, a kind of pattern, as though something else was moving, something unseen. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. Her breath hitched. She was no longer alone in this place. The sniffing noise came again, a soft, wet sound, like someone inhaling deeply, savoring the air. Emily's heart skipped a beat. She froze, her eyes scanning the darkness, trying to pinpoint the source. The room felt colder now, the shadows deeper, as if the darkness itself was alive, creeping into every corner, filling every inch of the space. She turned quickly, shining the beam of her flashlight toward the source of the noise, but found nothing. Only the remnants of forgotten furniture, pieces of broken glass scattered across the floor like brittle shards of some past memory. The sniffing sound was gone, leaving only silence in its wake, and yet that silence felt wrong. It felt like the kind of quiet you hear just before something terrible happens, the kind of quiet that fills the air with pressure, making every breath feel heavy, every sound too loud. Emily took another cautious step forward. It was then that she saw it, a faint movement in the corner of the room, just beyond the reach of her flashlight. A shadow that shouldn't have been there, shifting as though it were made of something other than light and darkness. Something in her gut twisted, and her hand instinctively tightened around the flashlight, her knuckles going white. The sniffing returned, louder now, more insistent, almost as if it was drawing closer to her. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling despite herself. There was no response, only that maddening sniffing sound. The air grew colder, the scent of decay more intense, until it was all-encompassing. It was as though the house itself was exhaling this foul, suffocating odor, feeding it into her lungs until she could no longer tell where the smell ended and her own fear began. Then, something moved. It wasn't the sound of footsteps, but the dragging noise of something heavy, something wet. Emily spun around, her heart pounding, her mind racing, but the room remained still, the shadows unchanged. The sniffing had become louder now, rhythmic, almost deliberate. It was as though whatever it was circling her, drawing nearer. And then she saw it. It was a shape. No, a presence. A vague form standing just beyond the pool of light cast by her flashlight. It was humanoid in shape, but its outline was unclear, as though it were fading in and out of focus, as though it existed in a space between realities. The smell grew unbearable now, almost suffocating her, and she staggered backward, her hand reaching desperately for the doorframe. But the door wasn't there anymore. The house had changed. The walls had closed in on her. She was trapped. The creature, if it could be called that, was moving toward her. She could see it now, or at least the outline of it. It was tall, impossibly tall, with a thin, sinewy body that seemed to bend and stretch in unnatural ways. Its face was obscured, but Emily could feel its gaze, cold and hungry, burning into her. The sniffing was deafening now, as though it was right beside her, breathing in the very air she exhaled. Suddenly, it lunged. Emily screamed, stumbling backward, her feet catching on something unseen as the flashlight flew from her hand, spinning away into the darkness. The smell flooded her senses, overpowering her, and the ground beneath her feet seemed to tilt, as though the very foundation of the house were shifting. In that moment, she knew this was no longer just a story. The house was alive, and it had been waiting for her. With a force beyond her understanding, Emily pushed herself to her feet and bolted toward the direction she hoped the door might still be. Her heart pounded in her ears, the suffocating stench clinging to her, choking her every breath. But she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. The door was closed now. She could feel it. Her fingers brushed the frame, and with a last desperate push, she slammed it open, the light of the dying day rushing in like a breath of fresh air. But as she stumbled out of the house, gasping for air, she knew it wasn't over. It was just the beginning. Chapter 3. The witnesses' days passed, but the grip of the town's strange, oppressive silence refused to loosen. It wasn't just the smell anymore. No, it had become something more pervasive, more invasive. It was the sense of dread that had seeped into the very bones of Greyfall. Emily could feel it everywhere she went, in the empty streets, in the hollow eyes of the townspeople, in the way the shadows clung too thickly to the corners of every building. It was as though the town itself was waiting, holding its breath for something to unfold. The encounters had only just begun, but Emily could already feel the shift within herself. She was no longer the curious, unshaken journalist she once was. The house, the place she'd ventured into that night, had changed her in ways she couldn't explain. The smell of decay still clung to her skin, a haunting presence that lingered in her clothes, her hair, even her thoughts. It was as if it had seeped into her very soul. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the shadowy figure, its impossible height, its face obscured, the way it had moved, almost like a distortion in the air, flickering in and out of existence. The sniffing, the dragging sound, she could still hear it in her mind, like a distant, persistent echo that refused to be silenced. It was becoming harder to distinguish where the nightmare ended and reality began. She didn't know if the house had changed her, or if she had changed the house. But it didn't matter. She knew she needed answers. The truth was buried somewhere in this town, hidden beneath layers of fear and time. And Emily wasn't the kind of person to shy away from the dark, not when it whispered its secrets so loudly. The next morning, she decided to seek out the town's elderly residents. There was one person in particular, Mr. Hawthorne, a frail, silver-haired man who had lived in Greyfall for as long as anyone could remember. He was the town's unofficial historian, always perched in the corner of the diner, mumbling to himself in a way that made the other residents uncomfortable. They never listened to him, of course. He was just the old man who lived with his memories, clinging to things that no one else cared to remember. But Emily had heard rumors. They said Mr. Hawthorne knew things about the town's past that no one else dared speak of. Things that, if told, would unravel the fabric of this place entirely. It was just after breakfast when she found him sitting at his usual spot in the diner, a chipped mug of coffee in front of him, his eyes staring out the window as if waiting for something, no, someone, to arrive. He didn't look at her as she approached, but Emily could feel the weight of his gaze settling on her, the way his eyes always seemed to peer into her, like he could see every question she had ever asked and every secret she had buried. "Mr. Hawthorne," Emily said softly, taking a seat across from him. Her voice felt small, even to herself, as though it might shatter the fragile quiet that had settled between them. "I need to ask you something. About Greyfall." He didn't respond right away, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted his cup, the thin rim clinking against the edge of the table. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he looked up at her, his eyes pale and distant. "I thought you'd come," he said, his voice a dry rasp that made her skin crawl. "I thought it would be you." Emily's heart stuttered, and she took a breath to steady herself. What do you mean? You know about the smell? About the house? He nodded, but his expression remained unreadable, like he was looking past her, beyond her, into a time and place she could not see. I know more than you think, more than anyone should. This town. He trailed off, his voice breaking in a way that made Emily's stomach churn. This town has its secrets, dark ones we were meant to forget. Emily's skin prickled. She had heard the rumors, of course, the whispered words that seemed to vanish as soon as they were spoken. They spoke of a curse, of something ancient and terrible that had taken root in the very soil of Greyfall. They said that the house where she had ventured wasn't just abandoned. It was forgotten. Forgotten by the town, forgotten by time. But she needed more than rumors. She needed answers. What happened? She pressed. What's going on? Why is this happening now? Mr. Hawthorne's eyes flickered for a moment, as if considering how much he should reveal. Then, with a long, shaky sigh, he leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper, though no one else was near enough to hear. It never left, he said. It's been waiting, always waiting. The house. It's not just a house, girl. It's a doorway, a threshold. Emily's breath caught in her throat. A doorway to what? His eyes darted around nervously, as though afraid the walls might be listening. To the other side, to something worse, something that was never meant to cross over. And now it has. A silence hung in the air between them, thick with the weight of his words. Emily felt an eerie chill settle over her, creeping down her spine, but she didn't look away. She couldn't. Tell me everything, she whispered, almost against her will. Please. Mr. Hawthorne stared at her for a long while, as though measuring the depth of her resolve. Then, as though he had made up his mind, he spoke, his voice trembling with the effort of dredging up memories long buried. It was years ago, a long time ago, he began, his eyes distant, lost in the past. Before the war. Before the town was even built, there was someone living here. A man, they said. He was a student of things, dark things best left forgotten. He was obsessed with the occult, with summoning. Emily felt a cold shiver as she leaned in closer. Summoning what? Not what? Who? Mr. Hawthorne corrected, his voice barely above a whisper. They say he made a pact with something ancient, a thing that existed before us, a thing that feeds on fear. The man, his name was Elias Blackwood. He thought he could control it, thought he could bind it to his will. Emily's pulse quickened as she gripped the edge of the table. What happened to him? To the thing he summoned? The man. Mr. Hawthorne's voice cracked, and he looked around once more, his eyes frantic. He vanished, of course, vanished without a trace. But the thing, it didn't go. It stayed. It waited. Emily felt the room close in around her. And the house? The house is where it happened, he replied gravely. Where the ritual was completed, where the pact was made. It was meant to be sealed. But sometimes things can't be sealed, girl. And now it is loose. Emily's breath caught in her throat. A dark chill settled over her, creeping through her veins like ice. This wasn't just a story. This wasn't just some old man's ramblings. This was real. And it was happening. Again. I saw it, she whispered, more to herself than to him. I saw it in the house, the creature, the thing. Mr. Hawthorne nodded slowly, his face pale and filled with sorrow. You saw the sniff, didn't you? The word sent a tremor through her. Sniff. He leaned back in his chair, his hands trembling. It's what we call it. Not because of the smell, though it does sniff, but because of the way it hunts. It's not human, Emily. Not anymore. It's a thing of darkness. It feeds on fear, on despair. Emily swallowed hard. And it's hunting me. Yes, Mr. Hawthorne said softly, his voice filled with a sadness that tore at her heart. It's hunting everyone. It's always been hunting. But now it has you. You opened the door. And it won't stop until it has taken everything from you. She stood up abruptly, her legs weak beneath her. The air in the diner had grown thicker, heavier, as though the walls themselves were closing in. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she forced herself to stand tall. She had to understand. She had to know more. "I need to find a way to stop it," she said, her voice firm. Mr. Hawthorne's eyes flickered with a mix of pity and fear. "You can't stop it. You've already crossed the threshold. And now, there's no going back." This version of Chapter 3 continues to build suspense, with Emily now learning about the dark history of the town and the entity that haunts it. Mr. Hawthorne's cryptic revelations provide a sense of foreboding, deepening the mystery and pushing Emily toward a confrontation with the creature that haunts Greyfall. Chapter 4: The Unseen Curse. The days blurred together as Emily wandered through Greyfall, her mind heavy with the weight of Mr. Hawthorne's words. The curse, the creature, the town's forgotten sins. It was all too much to bear. Each time she closed her eyes, she could still feel the cold of the house, the unnatural chill that had wrapped itself around her like a vice. Each time she inhaled, the stench of rot and decay seemed to follow her, creeping into her lungs, filling her with a sickening nausea. It was as if the very air was infected, and no matter where she went, no matter how far she travelled, she couldn't escape it. The people of Greyfall were no help. They had grown even more distant, if such a thing was possible. There were whispers behind closed doors, nervous glances over shoulders, but no one dared speak directly to her. She was an outsider, an intruder in a town that had long ago learned the dangerous art of silence. No one wanted to acknowledge what she was beginning to realize. This was no ordinary town, and the house she had stumbled upon was no ordinary relic of the past. Greyfall was cursed. But Emily couldn't stop. She had to keep going. She had to uncover the truth, even if it meant tearing open the dark wounds that the town had buried deep. She had to understand what was happening to her, why her thoughts had begun to twist and unravel, why her nights were filled with visions of the creature, its endless sniffing and the hollow dragging of its steps. She could feel it in her bones now. The curse was real. It wasn't just a part of the town's history. It was alive. It was growing. And it was waiting for her. The worst part was that she wasn't sure if she was losing her mind or if the curse was actually taking hold of her. There were moments when reality seemed to flicker, like an old film reel skipping frames. She would be walking down the street, the sun shining brightly, and then suddenly, everything would go dark. The sound of distant whispers, the feeling of eyes on her, would descend like a fog. She would blink, and the world would return to its dreary, muted state. The daylight no longer quite as warm, the shadows longer than they should have been, and the nightmares, they were becoming harder to distinguish from the waking world. She would wake in a cold sweat, gasping for air, but the smell of the house would linger on her skin, like something rotting just beneath the surface. She could still hear the creature's sniffing, could still feel its presence, as though it was standing just outside her bedroom door, waiting, watching, listening. The thing in the house, the sniff, it wasn't just a creature, it wasn't just a monster, it was a parasite feeding on the darkness that had settled over Greyfall, feeding on the secrets that had been hidden too long. Emily had to know more. She had to find out what had happened to Elias Blackwood, the man who had started it all. But Mr. Hawthorne had been right. No one in the town was willing to speak. They were too afraid, too ashamed. That evening, Emily made her way to the only place left she hadn't visited, the old cemetery on the outskirts of town. It was a place no one dared go after sundown, but Emily knew she had to try. There were rumors that Elias Blackwood was buried there, his grave marked by an unassuming headstone, blending in with the others. The cemetery had been abandoned for years, left to the mercy of time and nature. It was overgrown, the tombstones leaning precariously, the paths winding like forgotten trails through the underbrush. As Emily approached the entrance, she could feel the temperature drop. The air around her became thick, as if it were pressing in on her from all sides. The smell of damp earth and decaying leaves filled her nostrils, but it was more than just the scent of the forest. It was the smell of death, of something that had been buried long ago but had refused to remain silent. Her flashlight trembled in her hand as she stepped over the rusted iron gate and into the graveyard. The ground beneath her feet was soft, the earth heavy and moist, as though the graves themselves were shifting, as though they were not content to lie undisturbed. Each step she took felt like an intrusion, as though the cemetery was watching her, waiting for her to disturb its peace. The deeper she ventured into the cemetery, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The air was suffocating, thick with a kind of ancient energy that made Emily's skin crawl. She could feel the weight of the graves, each one a silent witness to the horrors that had transpired in this town. The darkness seemed to settle around her, folding in like a heavy blanket, and the whispers began again, distant, unintelligible, but unmistakably there. "Get out! You shouldn't be here!" The voice was faint, almost a breath on the wind, but Emily could feel it in her bones. The words echoed in her mind, like a warning, a command, and a plea all at once. But she couldn't stop. She wouldn't. Her flashlight flickered, and for a moment, the shadows seemed to warp, to shift, as though they were alive. Emily's heart pounded in her chest, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. She forced herself to move forward, her mind focused on one thing, finding Elias Blackwood's grave. It wasn't long before she found it, a simple stone marker, weathered by time, its inscription nearly illegible. She knelt beside it, brushing away the dirt and moss that had gathered over the years, her fingers trembling. As the stone cleared, the name became visible. Elias Blackwood, born 1812, died 1856. Seeker of shadows, keeper of the unseen. The words struck her like a slap. Seeker of shadows, keeper of the unseen. What had he been seeking? What had he unleashed? Her fingers traced the etching on the stone, and as she did, a low rumble echoed through the ground beneath her. At first, she thought it was just the wind, or perhaps the settling of old earth. But then the ground began to tremble, ever so slightly, as though something below was stirring. Something ancient, something that had never truly been buried. Suddenly, the air thickened, and the stench of rot and decay flooded her senses. The smell was unbearable, like a wound that had been left open too long, festering in the dark. She gagged, stumbling back, her heart racing as the ground beneath her seemed to ripple like the surface of a pond disturbed by an unseen force. And then, out of the darkness, came the sniffing, louder than before, closer than before. Emily's body froze. She didn't need to turn around to know it was there. She could feel its presence, like a shadow in the corner of her eye, lurking just out of sight. The sniffing grew more frantic, more urgent, as though it was closing in on her, its breath ragged, desperate. And then, without warning, the ground before her shifted, and a figure rose from the earth. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything she could have ever imagined. The shape was tall, taller than any man, and its form was a distortion, a twisted amalgamation of shadows and flesh. Its skin was pale, ashen, almost translucent, and its eyes, if they could be called eyes, were hollow, black voids that seemed to suck in the light around them. Its limbs were long and unnaturally thin, joints bending in impossible angles, like a puppet whose strings had been pulled by some twisted hand. But it was the mouth that terrified Emily the most. It was wide, too wide, stretching almost from ear to ear. Its lips peeled back to reveal rows upon rows of sharp, glistening teeth, glinting like shards of broken glass. And from that mouth came the sniffing, a sound like air being drawn in, deep and agonizing, as though it was savoring her fear. She couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. The air was thick with the stench of death, of something ancient and terrible, and the creature was closer now, its presence suffocating, overwhelming. Its head tilted slightly, its hollow eyes focusing on her with a hunger that made her blood run cold. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. The ground settled once more, the air cleared, and the cemetery was silent again. But Emily couldn't move. She couldn't comprehend what had just happened. Had she imagined it? Was she losing her mind? The answer was clear. No, it had been real. The creature was real. And now it was watching her, waiting. The whispers returned. Louder now. Get out! Get out before it's too late. But it was already too late. This chapter dives deeper into the supernatural horror surrounding Greyfall and the creature haunting Emily. The tension builds as Emily uncovers Elias Blackwood's grave and confronts the terrifying manifestation of the curse, heightening the sense of paranoia and fear. The sinister atmosphere continues to envelop Emily, blurring the line between reality and nightmare. Chapter 5. The Descent. The following days were a blur, fragments of time slipping through Emily's fingers like sand, slipping faster and faster until she could no longer remember what day it was or whether it even mattered anymore. She hadn't returned to the cemetery. The very thought of stepping foot near that graveyard again made her stomach twist with dread. The creature, the sniff, it had found her. It had risen from the earth like some cursed spirit, like a shadow made flesh. It was real. It wasn't a nightmare. It wasn't a figment of her imagination. Her hands shook as she sat at the small table in her motel room, her laptop open before her, the flickering light from the screen casting long shadows across the room. She had to keep moving. She had to keep searching, even if it meant driving herself further into madness. She had never been one to believe in the supernatural, at least not until now. Rationality had always been her anchor, her guide. But what had she just witnessed? Was there a logical explanation for what had happened in the cemetery? For the way the air had thickened? For the creature that had emerged from the earth? Its hollow eyes staring into hers like it could see straight through her soul. The cold sweat that had drenched her body in those moments still lingered on her skin. The scent of rot and decay clung to her hair, her clothes, despite her best efforts to wash it away. And the whispers. The whispers had followed her home. They were always just out of reach, faint and distant, but insistent. They echoed in her mind, in her ears, always there. Get out. Leave Greyfall before it's too late. She wasn't sure how much more of this she could take. The walls of the motel room seemed to close in on her at times, the darkness pressing against the thin veneer of light from the lamp on the nightstand. Her reflection in the window, distorted by the rain running down the glass, seemed to mock her. The world outside was blurry, distorted, and nothing seemed real anymore. She had no choice. She had to go back to the house, back to the heart of the mystery. The answers she needed were there. If she could just uncover what had happened, if she could just understand how Elias Blackwood had bound that creature, the sniff, maybe she could stop it. Maybe she could escape. But the thought of returning to the house made her skin crawl. The house had become something else in her mind, an accursed place that seemed to writhe in the darkness, alive in ways that no house should be. It was a place where time itself twisted, where the walls bled memories, and where the air was thick with something that wanted to consume her. Despite the terror that gripped her, despite the gut-wrenching sense of doom that weighed down her every step, Emily knew she had to return. She could feel it in her bones. The creature wasn't done with her. It would find her, no matter where she went. Greyfall wasn't a town that would let her leave once it had set its eyes on her. She grabbed her jacket and headed out the door. The journey back to the house felt interminable. The drive seemed to stretch on forever. The headlights of her car casting long, lonely beams through the fog, slicing through the darkness like a knife through silk. The road was narrow and winding, each turn more treacherous than the last. The trees that lined the path were bare, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal fingers, clawing at the sky. The air outside was cold, biting, and it carried with it the scent of earth and decay. As she neared the outskirts of the house, the dread in her chest grew. The house was just as she remembered. No, worse. Its silhouette loomed like a dark sentinel, the windows empty, staring out at her like hollow eyes. The door was ajar, as if waiting for her, as if it had been expecting her all along. The wind howled, pushing against her car, but she couldn't bring herself to stop. She parked at the foot of the driveway and stepped out of the car, the cold air hitting her face with a sharp sting. Her breath fogged in front of her, and she felt her heart begin to race as she made her way up to the house. The porch creaked under her weight, each step sounding like a warning, as though the house itself was protesting her return. The door, slightly ajar, seemed to beckon her inside. She hesitated, her fingers twitching nervously around the handle, but then the wind howled again, louder this time, and the door swung open with a violent force. Emily's stomach lurched as she stepped across the threshold. The house smelled the same. sickly, pungent, with a heavy stench of rot and mildew hanging in the air. The floorboards groaned beneath her feet as she slowly ventured deeper into the darkness. Each creak, each groan of the house seemed to reverberate in her chest, the sound oppressive, as though the walls themselves were alive and breathing. She reached the staircase and froze. There, at the top, she could see it again, the shadow. It was faint, but unmistakable. The same grotesque shape, flickering at the edge of her vision, like a distortion in the air. It was standing just out of reach of the light, its form elongated, twisted in ways that defied logic, as though its very being was too much for the world to contain. The sniff. It stood motionless, as if it were waiting for her, its hollow eyes turned in her direction. The faint sound of sniffing filled the air again, slow, deliberate, as though it were savoring the moment before the hunt. Her breath caught in her throat, and her body stiffened in fear. The creature didn't move, didn't advance. It just watched. In that moment, Emily understood something that chilled her to her core. The sniff wasn't just after her. It was after something else. Something buried deep within the house. Something that had been left behind. Something the creature wanted. Something that had drawn it to her in the first place. It wasn't just her fear it was feeding on. It was feeding on the house, on the curse that had taken root here, feeding on the darkness that had been unleashed. She wasn't the one it sought to consume. Not entirely. She was the bait. With trembling hands, Emily slowly reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out the journal. The one she had taken from Mr. Hawthorne's shelf. She had barely had time to glance through it before coming here, but now she knew it held the key. The journal spoke of rituals, of symbols, of the dark powers that had once been bound here. It wasn't just a record of Elias Blackwood's work. It was a map, a guide, a warning she had ignored. She turned the pages frantically, her eyes scanning for something, anything that could help. And then she found it. The ritual, the binding, the symbol. It was a dark sigil, drawn in thick, uneven lines, surrounding a circle. The words beneath it were in a language she didn't recognize, but she could feel their power emanating from the page. The curse had been sealed once, she realized, but something had gone wrong, and now the seal was weakening. Her hands shook as she traced the sigil with her finger. The words felt alive beneath her touch, as if the ink itself was pulsing with some dark, unseen force. No one escapes. The whisper came from behind her. Emily froze. The voice was low, guttural, and it came from within the house. It was the creature, the sniff. But this time, the sound was different. It wasn't the sniffing she had grown used to. It was a voice that reverberated through the very walls of the house, filling every corner with its darkness. It was the voice of the curse. It was the voice of Elias Blackwood. And it was coming for her. Chapter 6. The Awakening. Emily's fingers trembled as they hovered over the pages of the journal, tracing the symbols, the ancient runes, the forbidden language that danced before her eyes. The whispers were louder now, a constant hum in the back of her mind, growing more insistent with each passing moment. They weren't just in her mind. They were all around her, vibrating the very air, curling their way into the corners of the room, and clawing their way into her chest. "No one escapes," the voice had said. The words echoed through her skull, reverberating in the depths of her soul. No one escapes. It was a truth, cold and final. A warning. A curse that had been stitched into the very fabric of Greyfall, woven into the history of the Blackwood family, like some dark, forgotten thread that could never be unraveled. The sniff was still there, lurking just beyond her vision, its presence so overwhelming that she could feel it pressing against the walls of the house, pushing against her mind. But there was something more now, something else that stirred in the air. A force, a power that was ancient and alive, waiting for the moment to consume everything. The house. It wasn't just a place, it was a prison, a living, breathing prison. And she was the latest prisoner. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, as though the house itself was shuddering in anticipation. Emily's breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, the room seemed to pulse, as if the very walls were alive, moving and shifting with some terrible rhythm. Her heart pounded in her chest, a frantic, unrelenting drumbeat that drowned out everything else. She had to get out. She had to leave before it was too late. But where could she go? The creature was here. It was waiting for her. There was no escape. The house seemed to close in on her, its corridors stretching longer, darker. The shadows writhed and twisted in the corners of her vision, stretching like arms reaching for her, clawing at her skin, pulling her back toward the heart of the curse. She felt something brushing against her consciousness. Something ancient, something unfathomable. The sniff had always been here. It wasn't just a manifestation of fear or some twisted ghost of Elias Blackwood's failed rituals. No, it was something much older, much darker, and now it had claimed her. Her eyes snapped to the journal again, scanning the page where the sigil was drawn. There was something else, a note at the bottom of the page, scrawled in frantic handwriting, a warning written by someone who had known the cost of digging too deep. The ink was smudged, as if the writer had been rushing, as if their own sanity had been slipping as they penned the words. Once the seal is broken, the binding can never be undone. The creature will return. It is a part of the land, as much as the trees, the water, the soil. It feeds on the fear of the living, the sins of the past, and it will always return. No one escapes. No one escapes. Emily's chest tightened. Her breath became shallow as a cold wave of nausea washed over her. She had broken the seal. She had disturbed it, touched it, and now the creature was awake. But it wasn't just the creature she had woken. It was the curse, the entire history of this God-forsaken place, all the darkness that had been sealed away so long ago. The air around her grew thick, suffocating, and she could feel the presence closing in, creeping up her spine like a crawling shadow, as though the very fabric of reality were being torn apart. The sniff was coming. The creature, whatever it truly was no longer waiting in the shadows. It was here, inside the house with her. She could feel its breath on the back of her neck, the cold, fetid air that brushed against her skin, making her blood run cold. Her mind screamed at her to run, to escape, but her legs wouldn't move. Her body felt as though it were trapped in a nightmare, frozen in place by some invisible force. And then the whispering began again. Get out, leave now, it's too late. The voice was everywhere, surrounding her. It came from within the walls, from the floorboards, from the very air she breathed. But this time, the voice didn't sound like the soft, insistent warning it had before. Now, it was more like a chorus, 1,000 voices rising from the darkness, all speaking at once. Get out before it's too late. No one escapes. It wasn't just the creature speaking now. It was everything. The house, the land, the curse itself. They were all trying to consume her. She slammed the journal shut, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She could feel her sanity slipping, her grip on reality loosening with each passing second. The house was alive. It was watching her. The shadows were no longer shadows. They were hands, reaching for her, grasping at her, pulling her into the darkness. Her eyes darted around the room, desperate for something, anything that could help. The door to the hallway was a blur, the walls pressing in, and the whispers, God, the whispers, growing louder, until they filled her head like an incessant drumbeat. And then, just as she thought she couldn't take it anymore, she saw it. In the corner of the room, standing in the farthest reaches of the shadows, the sniff was there. Its form was even more grotesque than before. It wasn't a creature of flesh. It was a distortion, a flickering thing, like something that existed on the edge of reality, pulling at the very fabric of the world. Its limbs were elongated, twisted, impossible, its face a yawning abyss of emptiness, its hollow eyes black holes that seemed to pull everything into them. It sniffed the air, a long, drawn-out inhale, like it was savoring the moment before it descended upon her. And then it smiled. It wasn't a smile in the traditional sense, but rather a stretching of its face, a grotesque warping of its features that made her stomach churn. Its mouth split open, impossibly wide, revealing rows upon rows of sharp, jagged teeth that gleamed in the dim light, the scent of decay wafting from its mouth like an open grave. It stepped forward, its movements unnatural, like a marionette being jerked by invisible strings, its limbs jerking in strange, inhuman angles. Emily backed away, her mind racing, her body frozen in fear. "No one escapes," the voice whispered. But this time it wasn't the sniff. It was Elias Blackwood himself. His voice was low, raspy, like the rustling of dead leaves, and it came from everywhere. It was the house speaking, the earth speaking, the very land itself. The house was alive, the curse was alive, and it was feeding on her. Her legs gave way beneath her, and she collapsed onto the floor, her hands clutching the journal for dear life. The creature was so close now, she could feel its cold, rancid breath on her face, could hear the hollow sniffing growing louder, more desperate. And then, as if the air itself had shattered, the sniff reached out for her, its hands stretching impossibly far, its fingers gnarled and thin, like talons, like claws meant to tear into her very soul. But as it reached for her, something else happened. The room began to twist. The walls bent and buckled, the shadows warping, folding in on themselves like a sickening dance of reality being shredded apart. Time seemed to lose meaning. She was no longer in the room with the sniff. She was somewhere else, a place beyond the house, beyond the town. It was the curse, the binding. She had broken it, and now the world was coming undone. The air grew thick, suffocating, and Emily gasped for breath, her lungs burning. The whispers crescendoed into a deafening roar, and she could feel the land itself shifting beneath her, the earth opening up, a vast chasm of darkness swallowing everything in its path. The sniff was no longer just a creature. It was a part of the house, part of the land, part of the curse. It had always been here, waiting, feeding, and now it was free, and Emily was its next victim. And this chapter builds upon the rising horror and claustrophobia that Emily feels as she faces the sniff head-on and begins to understand the true nature of the curse that haunts Greyfall. As the house comes alive, bending and warping around her, Emily is pushed to the brink of her sanity. The very world around her begins to unravel, drawing her deeper into the nightmare, where the line between the living and the dead blurs, and escape becomes an impossible dream. Chapter 7. The Heart of the Curse. Emily's body was frozen, paralyzed by fear, yet she could not tear her gaze away from the creature. The sniff's presence filled the room like an oppressive weight, its twisted form hovering just at the edge of her vision, flickering and distorting as though it existed on the precipice of reality. The air grew thick, suffocating, and the faint smell of decay flooded her senses, mixing with the sourness of her own sweat and terror. Her breath came in shallow gasps, each inhale tasting like death, as the darkness in the corners of the room pressed against her, closing in. The creature moved closer, its limbs jerking unnaturally, and Emily could feel the floor tremble beneath her as it advanced. It wasn't like anything she had seen before, not a ghost, not a demon, not even a shadow. It was something older, something born from the very land itself. It wasn't just hunting her, it was hunting for something else, and she was the key. The room seemed to warp, to twist around her, as though the very space was bending in response to the creature's presence. The walls creaked and groaned, the wood warping and bending, as if the house were alive, its bones shifting in sympathy with the creature. The shadows seemed to move of their own accord, slipping along the edges of the room, beckoning her to follow. It was then that Emily realized something truly terrible. The sniff was not just an abomination, it was a guardian. The house had not simply been built on this land. No, it had been created here. The creature was the house's keeper, its prison warden, tasked with ensuring that whatever was buried beneath it stayed buried. And that was when the whispers returned, louder than ever, pressing into her mind, dragging her deeper into the nightmare. "You're too late!" the voice hissed, low and dangerous, curling through her mind like smoke. "It's already begun. The ritual is incomplete, and you cannot stop it." The air felt like it was thickening, the walls closing in tighter, suffocating her, pressing her closer to the center of the house, as if the very foundation was pulling her toward its heart. Emily's head spun. She had come here to understand, to stop the curse, to destroy the creature, but she had been blind to what lay beneath the surface. She tried to move, but her legs felt like stone. Her body was weighed down by the invisible presence of the creature, its very being preventing her from escaping. Her heartbeat echoed in her ears, a deafening drum of panic as the sniff's hollow eyes locked onto hers, its mouth stretching wider and wider, revealing the jagged rows of teeth. "You will never leave," it whispered, its voice like 1,000 rasping breaths, echoing around the room. "The land is hungry, and you are its feast." And then, with a sudden shift, it was gone. The room stilled. The walls stopped groaning, and the air became still, like the brief silence between the crash of waves. The shadows retreated, pulling back as if in fear, and the oppressive weight that had once pressed against her body lifted. Emily collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath, her heart hammering against her rib cage. She didn't know how much time had passed. It could have been seconds, minutes, or hours. Time no longer had meaning. The house had swallowed her whole, and now she was lost in its depths. Her hand still clutched the journal, but it had become slippery with her sweat. She opened it again, turning the pages frantically, looking for some kind of answer, some way to undo the damage. But the ink seemed to blur before her eyes, the symbols twisting and curling like living things, wriggling beneath her fingertips. But then, amidst the chaos of symbols and runes, her eyes landed on something. A name she recognized. Elias Blackwood. Her breath caught in her throat. She had read about Elias Blackwood before. The man who had founded the Blackwood estate. The one who had performed the rituals. Who had bound the creature to the land and to the house. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that the man had not been merely a practitioner of dark arts. No, Elias Blackwood had been consumed by his obsession, his desire to control, to conquer the darkness that had claimed Greyfall. Emily traced the name with her finger, reading the passage that followed it. The words on the page were blurred with age, the ink faded, but it was clear enough. The creature was never meant to be controlled. It was a force older than man, older than the earth itself, the land, the house. They were bound by blood and by sin. The ritual was never meant to contain the sniff, but to contain something else, a darkness, a force that fed on the suffering of those who dared to disturb it. Elias Blackwood had made a terrible mistake. The words hit her like a blow to the chest. The sniff was not a mere creature. It was a manifestation of the land's curse, a thing born from the deepest shadows of human greed and fear. It had not come into being because of Elias's rituals. It had been summoned by them, and it had never been meant to be bound. She slammed the journal shut, her mind racing, her thoughts fragmented and scattered. The house was still alive, still shifting, still hungry, and whatever was buried beneath it was beginning to awaken. It wasn't just the sniff she had to worry about. It was the source of the curse, the very heart of the evil that had plagued this land for centuries. The whispers were louder now. The voices of the dead, of the lost souls who had walked these halls before her, echoed through the rooms, seeping into the cracks of her mind. No one escapes. Her breath quickened as she stood, her legs shaky beneath her. She had to find it. She had to find the heart of the curse. If she didn't, if she couldn't stop it, then there would be no escape for anyone. No one in Greyfall would be safe. With grim determination, Emily turned and walked deeper into the house. The house was darker now, the shadows heavier, like dark ink spilled across the walls. Every step she took seemed to echo in the vast emptiness of the halls, her footsteps swallowed by the oppressive quiet that hung in the air. The walls creaked and groaned, as though the house itself were alive, as though it were shifting to close in on her. As she passed through the hallway, she noticed something strange. A door, one she had never seen before. It was set back into the wall, hidden in plain sight, as though it had always been there, waiting for her to find it. Emily hesitated, but only for a moment. She had come too far, seen too much, to turn back now. She grabbed the handle, and the door creaked open with an agonizing slowness, revealing a staircase that descended into darkness. The air grew colder, and she could hear the faint sound of whispers rising from the depths below. She didn't have to look back to know that the sniff was following her. Its presence was like a shadow, looming over her every step. But she couldn't stop. Not now. The very foundation of the house seemed to be pulling her deeper, as though it were hungry for what she might find below. Emily took a deep breath, steeling herself against the dread that clawed at her insides. She had no choice but to face what lay beneath the house, to confront the heart of the curse. Because if she didn't, if she failed, then the darkness would consume everything. And this time, it would be forever. As she descended into the darkness, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. The house was waking. The sniff was waiting. And something deeper, something far more terrifying, was stirring in the heart of the curse. Bafan Sandyan, this chapter builds on Emily's growing understanding of the dark history behind Greyfall and the creature that haunts it. It also heightens the sense of impending doom as Emily ventures further into the heart of the house, uncovering the terrible secret at its core. The sniff is not just a creature, it is part of the curse. And now that Emily has broken the seal, the true evil of the house is beginning to rise again. Chapter 8. The depths beneath the staircase creaked beneath Emily's feet as she descended into the heart of the house. With each step, the air grew heavier, thicker, as though the very atmosphere of Greyfall was suffocating her, pushing against her lungs, making it harder to breathe. The whispers, once distant and fragmented, were now a constant presence, crawling beneath her skin, sliding into her thoughts, mixing with her own inner fears. The sound of her heart thudded in her chest like a drum, but even that seemed to fade beneath the unholy hum that surrounded her. The walls of the staircase were lined with old, decaying wood, their surface slick with age and moisture. The scent of mildew, damp earth, and something far more putrid clung to the air. Her feet slipped on the worn steps, but she pressed on, driven by an instinct she could not name, as though the house itself was calling her, beckoning her into the depths. The temperature had dropped. It was as if she were no longer in a house at all, but in a cavern, an abyss, a place untouched by time or light. Her breath hung in the air, a thin mist that vanished almost as soon as it formed, swallowed by the consuming darkness. She was surrounded by silence now, the kind of silence that is not peaceful, but oppressive, the kind that feels like a weight pressing down on your chest, smothering you from all sides. As she reached the bottom of the staircase, she found herself in a large chamber. The stone walls, slick with dampness, loomed around her. The room was vast, stretching out before her into a darkness that was almost absolute. She could barely make out the far edges, where the shadows seemed to blend with the walls, as though they were part of the structure itself. The air was thick with the scent of decay and something ancient. Something that felt like it had been buried for centuries, waiting for the right moment to awaken. She took a step forward, and her foot landed on something soft, something that crunched beneath her weight. She looked down and her stomach churned. Bones, human bones, a mass of skeletal remains lay scattered across the floor, their brittle forms twisted in unnatural positions, as though the bodies had been left to rot here in some forgotten time. Some were partially crushed, others snapped in half, but all of them were eerily still, their empty eye sockets staring up at her, frozen in a moment of agony, trapped in this dark tomb for eternity. The sight made her blood run cold, and she took a step back, but her foot struck something else. Another bone, this one still clutched in a hand that had long since turned to dust. Her breath quickened as she realized the horrifying truth. These bones were not from any ordinary burial. They were the remains of the lost souls who had fallen victim to the house, victims of the curse, victims of the sniff. The sniff was no longer just a creature. It was a force, a being woven into the very bones of Greyfall itself. The blood of those who had come before her had soaked into the soil, had fused with the house, and now the house was feeding on her fear, just as it had fed on those who came before her. The walls seemed to close in on her as she stumbled backward, her heart racing. The darkness felt alive, crawling at the edges of her vision, as if the room itself were watching her, waiting for her to make the wrong move. She could feel the weight of the eyes on her, the cold breath of the sniff just beyond her reach, its presence pressing down on her, filling the air with a palpable sense of dread. Suddenly, the whispers returned, louder, more insistent. They had always been there, hidden beneath the surface, but now they had a voice, a chorus of tortured souls speaking in one unified, hollow tone. It's too late. There is no escape. You are ours now." The words froze her in place. The very air seemed to shift, like something deep within the walls was stirring, ready to consume her whole. Her skin crawled, and the darkness before her seemed to pulse with a life of its own. She couldn't move, couldn't think. Every part of her screamed to run, to escape, but the room had swallowed her whole. There was nowhere to go. And then, from the deepest shadows, a figure stepped forward. It was not the sniff. It was something older, something far worse. The figure moved with an unnatural grace, its shape emerging from the darkness like a shadow given form. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs stretched and thin, like the branches of an ancient tree, its body covered in tattered robes that seemed to writhe as though they were alive. The face, if it could even be called a face, was obscured by a hood, but Emily could feel its eyes on her, as though it could see directly into her soul. The figure extended a hand toward her, and in that moment, Emily understood. This was the source, the thing that had bound the sniff to the land, the thing that had kept it here, trapped in the depths of the earth, feeding on the suffering of those who had dared to trespass. The whispers grew louder, until they were deafening, filling every corner of the room, every inch of her mind. "You have awakened it," the figure intoned, its voice deep and resonant, like the rumble of thunder before a storm. "You have broken the seal, and now you will never leave." The ground beneath her feet trembled, and Emily felt the floor shift, the stone slabs beneath her cracking as though they were breaking apart. She stumbled backward, her heart pounding in her chest as the figure's hand moved toward her. Closer, closer, until it was only inches from her skin. But before it could touch her, the ground split open. A gaping chasm yawned beneath her, its dark mouth swallowing everything in its path. And before she could scream, Emily was falling. The wind howled around her as she plummeted, the air rushing past her ears, and the darkness swallowed her whole. And then everything went silent. Emily's body slammed against something soft, and she gasped for breath, her limbs aching as she tried to regain her bearings. The ground beneath her was no longer stone, but something far more unsettling. It was soft and yielding, like flesh, and she could feel it pulse beneath her as though it were alive. She struggled to sit up, her hands brushing against the surface, and her stomach churned as she realized she was lying in a vast cavernous space. A living space. The walls around her were not stone, but something darker, more organic. They seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, like the innards of some monstrous creature, breathing in and out, drawing her deeper into its grasp. The air was thick with a choking, suffocating heat, the smell of rot and something far worse, something that burned her lungs as she took a deep breath. And then, she saw it. At the far end of the cavern, a figure stood, draped in the same tattered robes, its face still obscured by a hood. But this time, the figure's presence felt different. It was not just watching her, it was waiting. "You cannot run," the figure's voice resonated in the air, and Emily could feel it reverberating deep within her chest. "You are already part of the curse. The land feeds on you. The house feeds on you. You are ours." Emily's body went cold, and she felt something stir within her, something deep and ancient. The sniff was not just a creature. It was the manifestation of the house's curse, a being born from the suffering of those who had come before, from the twisted desire to bind something that could never be controlled. And now, Emily was part of it. She was bound to the house, to the land, to the darkness that had consumed all those who had tried to escape. There was no way out. There was only the curse, and it would feed on her fear. It would feed on her soul until there was nothing left. The figure stepped forward, and as it did, the walls around Emily seemed to close in tighter. The air thickened, choking her, and the ground beneath her trembled as though something was coming, something even worse than what she had already faced. She was already lost. This chapter delves deeper into the chilling atmosphere of Greyfall, revealing the true extent of the curse that has trapped Emily within its walls. As she ventures into the heart of the house, she uncovers the horrifying truth. The land itself is alive, feeding on the suffering of all who enter, and the sniff is just one part of a far more malevolent force. The figure in the cavern represents the entity behind the curse, its dark, ancient power feeding off of her as she becomes a part of the house's horrifying history. The tension heightens as Emily faces the terrifying reality that the house is not just a place. It is a living, breathing entity, and she is its next meal. Chapter 9. The Veil of the Forgotten. The cavernous space seemed endless, a vast and cavernous chasm that swallowed the light whole, leaving only darkness in its wake. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she struggled to make sense of what she had just witnessed. The figure, the hooded entity that had waited for her in the depths, was no longer standing in the distance, watching. It had disappeared into the walls, or perhaps into the very shadows themselves, leaving only the oppressive weight of its presence behind. Her breath echoed in the suffocating quiet, each inhalation sharp and ragged as she forced herself to move. The ground beneath her feet still pulsed like a living thing, slick and soft, as though the earth itself was alive, breathing. She wanted to scream, to cry out, but she didn't know who or what she would be calling to. The cavern swallowed her voice, and the only response was the eerie, rhythmic pulse that beat from all around her. She reached out, her hand brushing the walls. Cold, wet, alive, the sensation was like touching skin, soft and slick with something vile. And beneath her fingers, she could feel it. A rhythm, a pulse, an almost mechanical thrum, as though the very walls were a heart beating, one that had not beat in centuries. Her mind reeled, and the reality of her situation crashed down on her in waves. This wasn't just a house. It wasn't just a curse. This was something far older, something deeper, something that had existed long before the Blackwoods had ever arrived. Something ancient, born from the earth itself, woven into the fabric of Greyfall like an infection that had spread through the soil, through the stones, through the bones of every living thing that had stepped foot on this forsaken land. The whispers were constant now, a flood of voices, murmuring indistinguishable words in the air. It was a chorus of torment, of lost souls that had been swallowed whole by the curse, their cries forever trapped in the dark. Emily clutched her ears, trying to block out the suffocating sounds, but they slipped beneath her skin, crawling inside her head like worms, gnawing at her thoughts. "Come closer," a voice whispered, its breath cold on the back of her neck. "Come closer, and you will see it all." She spun around, but the figure was nowhere to be seen. Only shadows, only darkness. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the journal once more, hoping to find some answer, some way out. But the pages were no longer filled with legible text. The words had blurred into inky smudges, crawling across the paper like insects, slipping and twisting with a life of their own. It was as if the journal itself had become a part of the house, consumed by its curse. It's already too late, Emily thought. But even the thought itself seemed hollow, as if the house had consumed her thoughts, her memories, until nothing was left but the pulse of the land. With trembling hands, she closed the book and shoved it into her bag. She didn't need answers, not anymore. What she needed now was to survive. She turned her back to the pulsating walls and began to walk deeper into the cavern, the air thick with a palpable sense of dread. Every step felt wrong, as though the ground itself was pushing back against her. She could feel the weight of the earth above her, heavy and oppressive, like the fingers of a giant hand pressing down, ready to crush her at any moment. The darkness seemed to thicken, curling around her like smoke, and the whispers, louder now, became more insistent, like a million voices urging her forward. "It was never meant to be stopped," a voice hissed. "You cannot fight what is older than time itself. You have already failed." Her legs faltered. She couldn't breathe. The air felt too thick, too heavy, but still she pushed on, driven by a strange compulsion. There was no choice now. The darkness had her in its grip, and there was only one way forward. The walls seemed to lean in closer, squeezing her as if they were alive, watching, waiting. Her heart beat louder, each thud like a hammer in her chest. It was then that she saw it. A light, a faint glow, far off in the distance, pulsing like a dying ember in the black. She wasn't sure if it was real or a figment of her mind, but something in her, the part of her that had not yet been consumed by fear, pushed her toward it. She stumbled forward, her eyes fixed on the light, the only thing in this nightmare that seemed like it might offer some answer. As she drew closer, the source of the light became clearer. A stone altar, drenched in shadows but bathed in an ethereal glow. The stones around it seemed to hum, vibrating with a dark energy that she could feel in the pit of her stomach. Something was alive here, something ancient and hungry. A symbol had been carved into the altar, an intricate design that spiraled in upon itself, winding into a dark, chaotic pattern that felt both familiar and incomprehensible. And at the center of the altar lay a figure, crumpled, broken, but unmistakably human. Emily's stomach turned, and she forced herself not to look away, even though every instinct screamed for her to turn and flee. The figure's skin was pale, stretched tight over bones that had long since started to decay. The eyes, wide and glassy, stared back at her, empty, lifeless, yet filled with something that made her want to scream. It was then that Emily realized the truth. The altar wasn't just an offering place, it was the vessel, the heart of the curse. It had been here for centuries, its origins lost in the fog of time. And the figure on the altar, the one that had once been a man, had been the last to give his soul to the land. His body, still warm and rotting, was an offering to whatever dark force had begun to stir beneath Greyfall. The whispers grew louder, swirling around her like a hurricane of voices, pulling at her mind, pulling at her body. She felt the earth move beneath her feet, and a crack echoed through the chamber. She could see the floor splitting open, a dark abyss opening at her feet. And from that abyss, something was rising, a creature, a thing that was neither fully human nor fully animal. It was a nightmare made flesh, its body covered in veins that pulsed with black blood, its eyes a molten yellow, burning with a fury older than time itself. Its limbs were twisted, bones cracking and shifting beneath the weight of its monstrous form. The air around it was thick with an oppressive energy, a stench of death and decay that filled her lungs with every breath. And behind it, the altar began to hum. "It is too late, Emily," the voice whispered from the darkness, and this time she recognized it. It was the same voice she had heard before, the figure that had guided her here, that had led her down this path of destruction. The house was no longer just a house, it was a prison for something far darker than the sniff. She could see it now, the ritual, the blood, the sacrifices, the lives consumed by the land. And as the creature stepped forward, its form looming over her like the shadow of death, Emily understood the terrible truth. This was never about escaping. The sniff, the figure in the shadows, it was all part of a greater plan. She was the final sacrifice, the last piece of the puzzle. Her soul, her life, was the key to the curse's completion. "The land calls to you," the voice continued, and Emily could feel her heart tremble in her chest. "You are the last, the final piece of the ritual. The curse cannot be undone. The land has claimed you." Emily fell to her knees, the full weight of her fate crashing down on her. The house, the land, it had consumed everything, everyone. And now, it would claim her as well. But she still had one choice, one last chance. The whispers surged louder, and the walls of the cavern pressed in on her. The creature's eyes glowed like molten fire, burning into her very soul. But as she looked down at the altar, her hand clenched around the symbol carved into its surface, and for the first time, Emily understood. The ritual could not be stopped, but it could be redirected. Her fingers traced the dark symbols, the ancient runes that had been carved into the altar by those who had come before her. They were twisted and malformed, but in them, she saw the truth. The ritual had never been meant for sacrifice. It had been meant to bind. With the last ounce of strength she had, Emily stood, her body shaking with the effort. The creature before her growled, a low, guttural sound, and the walls of the cavern began to rumble as if the land itself was reacting to her defiance. She took a deep breath and whispered the words she couldn't understand but knew she had to say. The darkness exploded around her. This chapter deepens the psychological horror and reveals more about the dark, ancient forces at work within Greyfall. The curse is revealed to be far older and more complex than Emily could have imagined, and now she must decide whether to break free or give in to the malevolent forces that demand her sacrifice. The tension is heightened as she faces the realization that she might never escape the land's insatiable hunger. Chapter 10. The Price of Freedom. The darkness was all-consuming. Emily stood at the center of the chamber, her heart racing, her breath shallow, as she felt the weight of her choices settling on her. The air was thick, heavier now than ever, pressing down on her chest like an invisible hand. The ground beneath her trembled, the walls pulsing with an energy that was foreign, ancient, and malevolent. The creature, if it could even be called that, loomed before her, its molten yellow eyes burning with an insatiable hunger. Its form twisted and writhed in the shadows, as though it were part of the land itself, a living extension of the curse that had consumed Greyfall and all who dared enter. Its jagged limbs scraped against the stone, a sound that made her skin crawl, like nails across a chalkboard. But Emily did not flinch. She couldn't, not now. She could feel the ritual unfolding beneath her fingertips, the words she had spoken vibrating in her very bones. The symbols carved into the altar beneath her hand had begun to glow with a faint, unnatural light, and the walls seemed to react, shifting, groaning, as if the land itself were alive, waking from a long, dark slumber. She understood now. The ritual, the curse, it wasn't just about sacrifice. It was about binding, about controlling the land, trapping it, enslaving it. Her thoughts flashed back to everything she had seen since she stepped foot in Greyfall. The whispers, the shadows, the rotting bodies beneath the floorboards, and the haunting vision of the figure that had led her here. It had all been a lie, a trap, a maze designed to keep her trapped in this place forever. But the ritual was never about letting the house consume her. It was about redirecting its power. "The land calls to you," the voice had said. And now, as she stood before the altar, she realized it wasn't just the land that had been calling to her. It was the curse itself, an ancient evil that had been bound beneath the soil, waiting for someone to unlock its power, waiting for someone foolish enough to try and break it. But Emily was different. She wasn't here to break it. She was here to control it. The creature in front of her hissed, the sound vibrating through the chamber like an earthquake. Its eyes glowed brighter, more intense, and Emily could feel its presence seeping into her bones, trying to break her will. It was no longer a mere thing of the shadows. It was part of the curse, part of the land itself. It wanted her to break, to submit, to give in to its power. But Emily refused. With every ounce of strength she had left, she closed her eyes and focused. The symbols beneath her hand began to pulse with light, a radiant glow that filled the room. She could feel the power rising within her, swirling around her like a storm, a vortex of energy that she could barely contain. The creature recoiled, its molten eyes narrowing as if it sensed what she was doing. She took a deep breath and stepped forward, her voice steady, though every part of her screamed to run. "I bind you," she whispered, her voice trembling with the weight of her words. "I bind you to this place. You are not free. You will never be free." The creature screeched, a sound that shook the very walls, its jagged form writhing in agony as the power of the ritual wrapped around it. But Emily didn't stop. The symbols on the altar began to shift and twist, their shapes becoming clearer, their meaning more defined. She could see the ritual unfolding before her like a tapestry, the threads of power weaving themselves together, pulling the creature into submission. "I command you," she said, louder now, her voice strong with conviction, "to remain here, to stay in the depths where you belong. You are bound to the land. You are bound to me." The creature howled, its body contorting as the light from the altar blazed brighter, filling the cavern with an otherworldly glow. The very air seemed to burn with the power of the ritual, the earth cracking beneath her feet as if the land itself were trying to resist. But Emily held her ground. Her fingers dug deeper into the altar, and she spoke the final words. "I release the curse from this land." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, everything was still. The creature froze, its yellow eyes fixed on her, its body twisted and contorted as if it were being torn apart by the power she had unleashed. The walls of the cavern shuddered, the pulse of the land growing weaker, more distant. Emily felt the force of the curse fighting against her, its malevolent power clawing at her from every side. But she knew this was the only way. This was the only way to end it. For a brief moment, time seemed to stand still. The air became thick, suffocating, as if the world was holding its breath. Then, with a deafening crash, the ground beneath her feet split open, the altar cracking down the middle, as if the land itself had been split in two. The creature screamed, a sound that shook Emily to her core, but it was no longer in control. The ritual had worked. The curse that had plagued Greyfall for centuries was broken. The land, the house, the creature, they were no longer bound together. The sniff, the whispers, the shadows, they all began to fade, as if they were being drawn back into the earth, back into the darkness from which they had come. But Emily knew that the price of her freedom had been paid. The creature, whatever it had been, was gone. But the cost of releasing the curse was far greater than she had anticipated. The walls of the cavern crumbled around her, the once solid stone shaking with the force of the ritual. The air was thick with dust and smoke, and she could feel the earth shifting beneath her feet as the house began to collapse. The ground was no longer solid. It was alive, twisting, writhing like a beast that had been wounded, its heart shattered. And Emily had become its heartbeat. Her body trembled, her limbs heavy with exhaustion. The power she had just wielded, the power of the land itself, was fading, but it had left its mark. She could feel it inside her now, a part of her, an essence that would never leave. She had bound the land, bound the curse, but in doing so, she had also become its vessel. The power of the ritual had claimed her, had twisted her into something both human and not. She wasn't sure if she could survive this. The walls continued to tremble as the cavern began to collapse in on itself. Emily could hear the rumble of rocks falling, the sound of the house crumbling from within. She could feel the earth beneath her feet slipping away, pulling her down into the abyss. But she didn't care anymore. All she wanted now was to escape. With one last, desperate push, she ran, her body moving on instinct, her legs carrying her toward the exit, toward the surface. The passage she had come through was still there, a narrow crack in the rock that seemed to beckon her like a lifeline. She wasn't sure how long she had left before the house consumed her, but she knew she couldn't stop now. As she made her way through the narrowing tunnel, the house began to scream, literally scream, as if it were alive, its very walls shaking with rage, with the agony of being torn apart. The cries of the house, the whispers, the shadows, the sniff, they all rose in a deafening crescendo, a final desperate attempt to claim her, to pull her back into the depths. But Emily did not stop. The light of the outside world began to shine through the crack ahead, a faint glimmer of freedom. She pushed forward, her heart pounding in her chest, her legs weak with exhaustion. And as she crawled through the final passage, bursting into the open air, she felt the weight of the land lift from her shoulders. The earth was still. The curse had been broken. She was free. But even as Emily collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air, she could feel it, deep within her, beneath her skin. The land's mark. The curse had been broken, but the power of it, the darkness, was still inside her. It would always be there. And she would always be bound to Greyfall. Epilogue. The echo of shadows. The sun set behind the hills, casting a final blood-red glow over the land that had once been Greyfall. The house, if it could still be called that, stood silent in the distance, a hulking shell of twisted wood and rotting stone. The windows were shattered, the doors long since consumed by the earth. There was nothing left of the place but its memory, the lingering scent of decay, and the faint echoes of a curse that had been broken, but not undone. Emily stood at the edge of the ruins, her face pale and drawn, her eyes hollow as if some part of her soul had been drained, pulled from her and buried deep beneath the earth. She had escaped the house, but not unscathed. The power of the curse, the land's will, still thrummed beneath her skin, a constant, unsettling presence that would never fade. It whispered to her in the silence of the night, calling her back, reminding her that no one ever truly leaves Greyfall. She hadn't realized how deep the wound went until she was free. There were no walls around her now, no dark corridors to navigate, no physical chains to bind her, but she was bound all the same. The land had marked her, left its dark imprint on her soul. Every step she took felt like it was being watched. Every breath was filled with the weight of 1,000 forgotten lives. The land was still hungry, still searching for a way to return to its former strength, and it had found its new vessel in her. She turned away from the ruins and walked toward the distant forest, her legs moving on their own accord, her mind numb. The world outside Greyfall seemed too bright, too alive, unnatural almost. The birds chirped, the trees swayed in a breeze that felt too clean. She was not part of this world anymore. She had crossed a line, stepped into a place where the light couldn't reach. The whispers had grown louder, more insistent, like the constant tick of a clock she could never silence. They reminded her of the price she had paid. "You cannot escape," they said. The trees whispered her name. "It is not over." It never would be. Not for her. Not for anyone who dared to set foot in Greyfall. The land had been broken, yes. The curse had been severed. But in its place, something else had been born. She had been the key to breaking the curse, but she had also been its new keeper. The sniff had been banished, but another darkness had taken its place. One that lived inside her, feeding on her fear, her regret, and her growing isolation. Emily's fingers tightened around the worn journal that she had kept, the last remaining tether to the world she had once known. The pages were faded, the ink smeared from the tears she had shed. It was all she had left. She had destroyed the house, ended its reign of terror, but the knowledge of what had truly happened there, what she had truly become, had seeped into her every thought. And as she walked, the shadows seemed to stretch toward her, clinging to her like a second skin. Somewhere deep in the distance, the sound of a door creaked open, faint at first, then louder. A figure stood in the threshold, its face hidden beneath the hood of shadow, its presence familiar and yet unsettling. The shape of it, tall, cold, unyielding, reminded her of something she had once seen, somewhere deep in the heart of the house. It was a reflection, a twisted version of herself, one that would never truly leave. The air grew heavier around her, thick with the stench of the earth, and Emily knew. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that it was still watching her. The land had chosen her, and it would never let her go. No matter how far she ran, no matter how many miles she put between herself and the ruins of Greyfall, it would always be there, lurking in the corners of her mind. Her footsteps faltered, but she did not look back. She couldn't. For there was nothing left behind her now but the remnants of a house that had once stood tall, its walls full of secrets and darkness. But the land itself, was eternal, and so too would be the curse it had created. In the silence of the night, the whispers continued. She would never be free. The house had claimed its price, and the land had found its new keeper. The end. In this closing segment, the story leaves an unsettling finality to Emily's fate. The curse may have been broken, but Emily is irrevocably tied to the land, a symbol of its haunting grip. The darkness that once haunted Greyfall has not disappeared. It has simply shifted. Emily, now forever intertwined with the land, becomes both a victim and an agent of the curse. The ending is open, leaving readers with a sense of unease, knowing that the nightmare may never truly end.